January 4th, 1943. Nizhny Tagil, Soviet Union. On this exact date, Chief Engineer Alexander Morozov received an order that would either make him a hero or put him in front of a firing squad. Design a tank killer. You have 25 days, not 25 months, 25 days. Here is what makes this story insane. In 1943, developing a new armored vehicle took 18 months minimum. Morozov had less than 4 weeks. The penalty for failure was death. And the weapon he proposed to build had never been attempted by any nation on Earth. A 152mm siege gun designed to destroy concrete bunkers mounted on a tank chassis. Every engineer who heard the idea said the same thing. The recoil will tear the vehicle apart. The crew will die on the first shot. It is physically impossible. Morozov built it anyway. What he created would destroy 12 German Tigers in its first combat engagement. Soviet soldiers gave it a name that sent chills down German spines. Zveroboy, the beast hunter. But before we talk about how this weapon changed World War II, you need to understand why Alexander Morozov was willing to risk everything on an idea that everyone called suicide. August 29, 1942. A new German tank rolled onto the Eastern Front for the first time. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger. 57 tons, over 100 millimeters of frontal armor, an 88mm gun that could kill any Soviet tank from 2 kilometers away. The Tiger was not an improvement over previous German tanks. It was a revolution. Soviet intelligence first reported Tiger encounters near Leningrad in September 1942. The reports were dismissed as exaggeration. "Our T-34 is the best tank in the world," Moscow replied. "No German vehicle can threaten it." Then the casualty reports started arriving. September 1942. A single Tiger destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in one engagement near Maga. October 1942. Tigers at Rostov wiped out an entire tank brigade in 3 hours. November 1942. The loss ratio hit 17-1. For every Tiger destroyed, 17 T-34s burned. 17 crews died. Soviet tank commanders started refusing to engage Tigers. They called it suicide. They were not wrong. The T-34's 76mm gun could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor at any range. Soviet tankers were shooting at Tigers from 200 meters and watching their shells bounce off like rain. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88 could kill a T-34 from 500 meters. The math was brutal. By the time a Soviet tank got close enough to maybe hurt a Tiger, that Tiger had already killed 7 of its friends. Moscow demanded solutions. The generals demanded solutions. Stalin himself demanded solutions. Soviet engineers worked around the clock. They upgraded the T-34's gun to 85 millimeters. Better, but still not enough against Tiger frontal armor. They designed new heavy tanks, the IS-1, the IS-2. But new tanks take years to develop, test, and mass produce. Years the Soviet Union did not have. German intelligence indicated a massive offensive planned for summer 1943. Thousands of Tigers and the new Panther tanks would attack the Kursk salient. If the Soviets could not answer German heavy armor by then, the war might be lost. Every failed solution cost lives. Every week of delay meant more burning T-34s, more letters to mothers telling them their sons were not coming home. More German advances. The Soviet tank force was bleeding to death, and the clock was running out. Alexander Morozov knew this better than anyone. Because the T-34, the tank that was failing against Tigers, was his design. Morozov was 38 years old in January 1943. Lean, sharp-featured with dark circles under his eyes that had been there since 1937. He wore glasses. He looked like a university professor. He had never fired a weapon in combat, but he had designed the most produced tank in history. Over 84,000 T-34s would eventually be built, more than any other tank ever made. Morozov had given the Soviet Union a weapon that saved Moscow in 1941. A weapon that turned the tide at Stalingrad. A weapon that should have won the war. And now he watched that weapon burn on battlefields across Russia, destroyed by something he never anticipated. The intelligence photographs arrived on his desk in early January. Tigers at Leningrad, tigers at Rostov, tigers everywhere. In every photograph, the same image. Blackened T-34 hulls, dead crews. Morozov studied those photographs until his eyes ached. He calculated armor angles. He ran penetration formulas. And he reached a conclusion that felt like a knife in his chest. His tank, his masterpiece, his life's work was useless against tiger armor. The T-34 could not hurt tigers. But tigers could kill T-34s at will. Most engineers would have accepted defeat, would have waited for the new heavy tanks, would have hoped someone else solved the problem. Morozov was not most engineers. He had built the T-34 when everyone said sloped armor was impractical. He had evacuated factory number 183 across 1,000 kilometers when the Germans advanced, moving 500 train cars of equipment through freezing temperatures while bombs fell around them. He had kept production running through the worst winter in living memory, when workers collapsed from cold and exhaustion and died at their stations. Alexander Morozov did not accept defeat. He found solutions. And staring at those photographs of burning T-34s, he thought of something that made other engineers laugh out loud when he mentioned it. The ML-20 howitzer, a 152mm siege gun designed to destroy concrete fortifications. The shells weighed 48 kilograms each. The gun itself weighed over 7 tons. When fired, the recoil generated enough force to push the gun backward 2 meters, even with a massive trail system dug into the ground. No one had ever mounted an ML-20 on a tank chassis. The reasons were obvious, and they were insurmountable. The recoil would tear any mounting apart. The weight would crush any suspension. The ammunition was too heavy for a crew to handle in an enclosed space. A T-34 turret could never accommodate such a weapon. It was impossible. Engineers at 3 different design bureaus had already rejected the concept. But Morozov kept returning to one simple fact. The ML-20 could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The Tiger had 100 millimeters of frontal armor. The math worked. If he could put an ML-20 on tracks, he could kill tigers. When factory director Isaac Zaltzman heard the proposal, he thought Morozov had lost his mind. A siege gun on a tank chassis. The first shot will kill the crew. Morozov had answers. No turret. A fixed casemate like the German assault guns. The vehicle would turn to aim, not the gun. Use the KV-1S heavy tank chassis already in production, strong enough to handle the weight. Design a new recoil system using hydraulic buffers from naval guns and industrial presses. Combine components that were never designed to work together. Make it work anyway. Zaltzman was still skeptical. Then Morozov told him about the message from Moscow. The State Defense Committee wanted a tank destroyer capable of killing tigers. They wanted a working prototype in 25 days. They wanted mass production ready by March. Any delay would be considered sabotage. Zaltzman understood what sabotage meant. A bullet in the Lubyanka basement. His family in the Gulag. 25 days suddenly seemed achievable. January 5, 1943. Morozov gathered every engineer in factory number 183. 37 exhausted men in a design hall so cold their breath formed clouds. He told them what Moscow demanded. He told them what he proposed. And he told them the truth. This should take 18 months. We have 25 days. If we fail, we die. If we succeed, we save the tank crews dying on the front. No one asked questions. They all knew the stakes. Morozov divided them into 4 teams working simultaneously. Chassis adaptation, gun mounting, recoil management, armor layout. Normal engineering process was sequential. Design, then test, then build. They had no time for normal. Teams worked in parallel solving problems that depended on solutions other teams had not finished yet. Engineers slept at their drafting tables. 4 hours of rest, then back to work. Days blurred together. The breakthrough came on day 3. Junior engineer Lev Gorlitsky proposed a hybrid recoil system. Take hydraulic buffers from naval gun mounts. Combine them with shock absorbers from industrial presses. Create something that had never existed using parts that were never designed to work together. Morozov ran the calculations. It might work. It might work. They had nothing better. By day 7, the basic design existed on paper. A brutal, ugly vehicle. A box-shaped casemate on a KV-1S chassis with a massive gun protruding from the front. No elegance. No refinement. Just armor tracks and the biggest gun the Soviet Union could fit onto a mobile platform. Zaltzman visited the design bureau on day 9. He studied the drawings in silence. His only questions were practical. Can we build it with available materials? Can it destroy a Tiger? Can production start by March? Morozov answered yes to all 3. He was promising things that had not been proven. He had no choice. Construction began on day 12, while design details were still being finalized. Welders worked from incomplete blueprints. Machinists fabricated components while specifications changed around them. The factory floor became controlled chaos. Sparks noise men working through exhaustion because stopping meant failure, and failure meant death. On day 17, the casemate was welded to the chassis. On day 20, the ML-20 with its experimental recoil system was mounted into position. On day 24, the prototype sat in the factory yard. It looked crude. Welds still showed grinder marks. Paint was barely dry, but it existed. 24 days from concept to physical reality, something that should have been impossible. Day 25, January 29, 1943, the proving grounds north of Nizhny Tagil. The test crew were volunteers, wounded tankers who understood they might die. Driver Dmitry Kulikov had lost 2 fingers to frostbite at Moscow. Gunner Pavel Olenek walked with a permanent limp from shrapnel at Bryansk. They climbed into a vehicle that had never been fired. A vehicle that every calculation said might tear itself apart with the first shot. Moscow observers stood at a safe distance. Political officers, factory administrators, men who would report directly to Stalin, men who would decide if Morozov lived or died. The target was 500 meters away, 80 millimeters of hardened steel at 30 degrees, the same protection as a Tiger's frontal armor. Olenek aimed. The loader confirmed the shell was seated. Morozov stood close enough to see the result, far enough to maybe survive if the vehicle exploded. His hands were shaking. His entire career, his life, his family's fate, all depended on the next 3 seconds. The ML-20 fired. The sound hit like a physical blow. The prototype rocked backward tracks, lifting off frozen ground, then crashing back down. Smoke erupted from the barrel. For a moment, no one could see anything. Then the smoke cleared. The prototype sat intact. No structural failure, no torn mounting. The recoil system worked. At the target line, observers found a hole punched clean through 80 millimeters of steel. At 500 meters. At 30 degrees. The impossible weapon worked. The Moscow colonel asked one question: how soon can production begin? Within weeks, factory number 183 was building what would be designated the Su-152. When the report reached Stalin, he read it twice. Then he ordered maximum production priority. He ordered ML-20 howitzers transferred from artillery units to armored forces. He ordered Morozov awarded the Order of Lenin. The 25-day miracle had succeeded. But building a prototype was one thing. Killing Tigers in actual combat was another. German intelligence was already reporting Operation Citadel, the largest tank battle in human history. Thousands of Tigers and Panthers would attack Kursk in summer 1943. The Su-152 had proven it could penetrate Tiger armor on a test range. But could it survive real combat? Could crews with only 11 days of training face the most powerful tanks Germany had ever built? In Part 2, we follow Lieutenant Anatoly Spirov to Kursk. July 1943. 3 Tigers advancing on his position. 7 shells remaining. What happened next made the Su-152 legendary. It also made German tank commanders fear a Soviet weapon for the first time in the war. The Beast Hunter was about to earn its name. In Part 1, Alexander Morozov did the impossible. He designed a tank destroyer in 25 days. A 152mm siege gun mounted on a tank chassis. Every engineer said it would tear itself apart. It did not. The prototype worked. The test was successful. Moscow was impressed. But here is what nobody tells you about military innovation. Building a prototype is the easy part. Getting the Red Army to actually use it is where dreams go to die. Because between Morozov's working prototype and the front line stood something more dangerous than German Tigers: Soviet military bureaucracy. In February 1943, the Red Army had 47 different committees that had to approve new weapons. 47. Each one filled with generals who had been fighting wars since before Morozov was born. Generals who did not like engineers telling them what weapons they needed. Generals who had careers to protect and reputations to maintain. And one of those generals was about to become Morozov's worst nightmare. His name was Lieutenant General Yakov Fedorenko, commander of the Red Army's armored and mechanized forces. The man who decided what tanks the Soviet Union built, and he hated the Su-152. February 14, 1943, Moscow. Main Armored Directorate Headquarters. Morozov stood in a conference room that smelled of cigarette smoke and old leather. Across the table sat Fedorenko, a barrel-chested Ukrainian with a scar across his left cheek and eyes that had watched men die at Khalkhin Gol at Finland at Moscow. Beside him sat 4 colonels, each one responsible for different aspects of armored warfare doctrine. None of them were smiling. Fedorenko had read the test reports. He had seen the photographs. He had reviewed the penetration data. And his first question cut straight to the problem. "How does the crew aim this thing?" Morozov explained. The casemate was fixed. The entire vehicle had to turn to engage targets, like the German Sturmgeschütz assault guns. Fedorenko slammed his palm on the table. "The Germans use assault guns for infantry support. They hide behind lines and shoot at bunkers. You want me to send crews into tank battles with a vehicle that cannot traverse its gun against Tigers that can rotate their turrets in 15 seconds. Morozov tried to explain the tactical doctrine. The Su-152 was not meant to duel Tigers in open terrain. It was meant to ambush them from prepared positions, to use the 152mm gun's devastating power to destroy heavy armor before they could close to effective range. Fedorenko interrupted. "I have been fighting tanks for 15 years. I know what works and what gets crews killed. A vehicle without a turret is a coffin waiting to be flanked." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Fedorenko raised every objection Morozov had already heard, and a dozen he had not anticipated. The ammunition was too heavy. Loaders would exhaust themselves after 10 shots. The vehicle was too slow. Tigers would outmaneuver it. The gun depression was insufficient for hull-down positions. The crew compartment was too cramped for sustained combat operations. Each objection had technical merit. Each one revealed years of hard-won battlefield experience. And each one pushed the Su-152 further from production approval. When the meeting ended, Fedorenko delivered his verdict. "The concept shows promise, but requires 18 months of additional development. We will revisit this after the summer offensive." 18 months. The Germans would launch their attack in 5 months. By then, thousands more Soviet tankers would die in T-34s that could not hurt Tigers. Morozov left the meeting knowing that official channels had failed. The Su-152 would never reach the front through normal approval processes. He needed another way. He needed someone who could overrule Fedorenko. He needed a miracle. The miracle came 3 days later in the form of a phone call from the Kremlin. Vyacheslav Malyshev, was the People's Commissar for Tank Industry. He reported directly to Stalin. He controlled every tank factory in the Soviet Union, and he had been reading the casualty reports from the front with growing alarm. The loss ratios against Tigers were unsustainable. Soviet tank production could replace destroyed vehicles, but experienced crews took months to train. The Red Army was bleeding expertise faster than it could be replaced. Malyshev had seen Morozov's test results. He had spoken with the Moscow observers who witnessed the prototype destroy 80 millimeters of hardened steel. And unlike Fedorenko, Malyshev understood industrial production. He knew that the Su-152 used existing components. The KV-1S chassis was already in production. The ML-20 howitzer had been manufactured since 1937. Factory number 183 could begin mass production within weeks, not years. Malyshev invited Morozov to Moscow, not for another committee meeting, for a private conversation in his office at the commissariat. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Malyshev asked detailed questions about production timelines, material requirements, and manufacturing bottlenecks. He asked about crew training and maintenance needs. He asked what would happen if the Su-152 faced Tigers in actual combat, not controlled test conditions. Morozov answered honestly. In prepared defensive positions, the Su-152 would devastate German heavy armor. The 152mm gun could destroy any tank Germany possessed at ranges beyond effective return fire. But the vehicle had limitations. No turret meant vulnerability to flanking attacks. Limited ammunition capacity meant careful shot selection. Poor gun depression meant difficulty in certain terrain. It was not a perfect weapon. It was a weapon they could build now with existing resources. Malyshev made a decision. He would arrange a demonstration for the State Defense Committee, Stalin's inner circle, the men who made decisions that generals like Fedorenko had to obey. But the demonstration had to be spectacular. It had to prove beyond any doubt that the Su-152 could kill Tigers. One test, one chance. If it failed, Morozov's career was over. If it succeeded, the Su-152 would be in mass production within a month. The demonstration was scheduled for February 28, 1943. Morozov had 14 days to prepare. February 28, 1943. Kubinka Proving Ground, 60 kilometers west of Moscow. The temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the testing range in a white blanket broken only by the dark shapes of target vehicles arranged at varying distances. The State Defense Committee had sent 3 representatives. Alongside them stood Fedorenko, arms crossed, expression skeptical. Malyshev stood apart from the group, his face revealing nothing. This was not a simple weapons test. This was a political trial with Morozov's life as the verdict. The targets were not steel plates this time. They were actual German tanks, captured at Stalingrad. A Panzer IV at 400 meters. A Panzer III at 600 meters. And at 800 meters the prize. A Tiger captured nearly intact when its crew abandoned it after running out of fuel. Real armor, real thickness, real angles. No laboratory conditions or optimized setups. The Su-152 prototype sat at the firing line, its engine rumbling in the cold air. The crew was the same team from the Nizhny Tagil tests. Driver Kulikov, gunner Olenek. They had volunteered again, knowing that failure in front of Stalin's representatives could mean more than just career consequences. Morozov stood beside the vehicle, close enough to observe every detail. His notebook was ready. His hands were steady, though his heart was not. Fedorenko approached before the test began. He spoke quietly so only Morozov could hear. "I hope for your sake this works, engineer. I have seen too many promising weapons fail in actual conditions. Theoretical success means nothing. Combat decides everything." Morozov nodded. He had nothing to say. Words were meaningless now. Only results mattered. The first target was the Panzer IV at 400 meters. An easy shot. A confidence builder. Olenek aimed. The loader confirmed the high explosive shell was seated. The order came to fire. The ML-20 roared. The Panzer IV exploded. Not penetrated. Exploded. The high-explosive shell struck the turret ring and detonated with enough force to blow the turret completely off the hull. It tumbled through the air and crashed into the snow 10 meters away. The State Defense Committee representatives stopped talking mid-sentence. Fedorenko's arms uncrossed. Even from 400 meters, they could see that the Panzer IV was not just destroyed. It was demolished. The second target. Panzer III at 600 meters. This time, an armor-piercing round. The gun fired. The shell punched through the frontal armor and exited through the engine deck. Through the vehicle, in one side and out the other. The observers walked to the target after the shot. They found entry and exit holes the size of dinner plates. Any crew would have been killed instantly. Then came the Tiger. 800 meters. Frontal armor. The shot that would decide everything. Olenek took his time. The Tiger sat motionless, its massive silhouette dark against the snow. 100 millimeters of frontal armor angled at 10 degrees. The armor that had made Soviet tank crews call Tiger engagement suicide. The armor that Fedorenko believed no Soviet weapon could reliably defeat. Fire. The ML-20 spoke. The shell crossed 800 meters in less than a second. Impact. The Tiger rocked backward from the force. Smoke erupted from the point of impact. When the observers reached the target, they found a hole punched through the frontal armor. Clean penetration at 800 meters. The shell had continued into the fighting compartment and detonated, destroying everything inside. Fedorenko examined the damage personally. He ran his gloved hand along the edges of the penetration hole. He looked at the devastation inside the compartment. When he turned back to face the group, his expression had changed. He said nothing. He did not have to. The evidence spoke louder than any words. Malyshev addressed the State Defense Committee representatives. 3 targets, 3 kills, at ranges that exceed any Soviet anti-tank weapon currently in service. The representatives conferred briefly. Then the senior member, a deputy commissar with direct access to Stalin, announced the decision. Immediate mass production. Priority allocation of materials. Factory number 183 would receive whatever resources it needed. The target was 25 vehicles per month by April, ramping to 100 per month by summer. Morozov had won. But winning approval was only half the battle. March through June 1943 became a logistics nightmare. Factory number 183 had to produce Su-152s while continuing T-34 production. Workers who had already been pushed beyond exhaustion found new reserves of energy. The first production vehicles rolled off the line in March, but production was only part of the problem. Crews needed training. Experienced tankers had to learn entirely new tactics. The Su-152 fought differently than any vehicle they had operated before. No turret meant positioning was everything. The heavy gun meant slow reload times. The limited ammunition capacity meant every shot had to count. Training programs were established in April. Tank crews pulled from reserve units attended 2-week courses. They learned to position their vehicles for ambush. They learned to calculate ranges for the powerful but slow-moving 152mm shells. They learned that the Su-152 was not a dueling weapon, but an assassination weapon. Hide, wait, kill, withdraw. The tactics were closer to sniper doctrine than traditional armor warfare. Resistance came from unexpected sources. Veteran tank commanders who had survived years of fighting did not trust a vehicle without a turret. They had seen too many assault gun crews die when enemies flanked their immobile guns. Training instructors heard the same objections Fedorenko had raised. How do we engage targets on our flank? What happens when Tigers maneuver against us? Why should we trust this untested weapon? Morozov traveled to training facilities personally. He explained the design philosophy. He showed penetration test results. He demonstrated that 152mm high-explosive shells could disable Tigers even without full penetration through sheer concussive force that cracked welds and damaged external components. Slowly, skepticism transformed into cautious optimism. By June, 3 heavy self-propelled artillery regiments had been equipped with Su-152s. 70 vehicles total. Not enough to counter the thousands of German tanks massing for Operation Citadel, but enough to prove whether the concept worked in actual combat. The first combat engagement came on July 5, 1943, the opening day of the Battle of Kursk. Near Poniri Station, a single Su-152 company encountered advancing Panther tanks. The result shocked both sides. In 20 minutes, the company destroyed 8 Panthers. 8. From prepared positions at ranges exceeding 600 meters. German after-action reports described the new Soviet weapon with alarm. A heavy assault gun with a gun of approximately 150 millimeters, capable of destroying our heaviest armor at long range. Recommend immediate tactical adjustment. The tactical adjustment meant German tank commanders started avoiding areas where Su-152s might be positioned. They started treating Soviet defensive lines with respect they had never shown before. For the first time in the war, German tankers feared a Soviet armored weapon. Word spread through the Red Army. The Beast Hunter, the vehicle that could kill Tigers. Tank crews who had spent 2 years dying in outgunned T-34s suddenly had hope. The impossible had happened. Soviet engineering had answered German technological superiority. But Kursk was just beginning. The Germans had committed over 2,700 tanks to Operation Citadel, including 200 Tigers and nearly 300 Panthers. 70 Su-152s could not stop that armored tide alone. They could only demonstrate what was possible. The real test would come in the days that followed. Days when Lieutenant Anatoly Spirov would face 3 Tigers with only 7 shells remaining. Days when German tank commanders would learn that the age of easy victories against Soviet armor was over. In Part 3, we follow the Su-152 into the heart of Kursk. July 12, 1943. The largest tank battle in human history. Over 6,000 armored vehicles clashing in a single day. And in the chaos, something unexpected happened. German commanders captured a disabled Su-152 and discovered just how simple its construction was. Within weeks, German intelligence was warning Berlin. The Soviets can produce these tank destroyers faster than we can build Tigers. The mathematics of armored warfare had shifted, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. In Part 1, Alexander Morozov designed a tank killer in 25 days. A 152mm siege gun on a tank chassis. Everyone said it was impossible. In Part 2, he fought Soviet bureaucracy and won. The Su-152 entered mass production. By July 1943, 70 beast hunters reached the front lines just as Operation Citadel began. In their first engagement, they destroyed 8 Panthers in 20 minutes. German tank commanders who had spent 2 years dominating Soviet armor suddenly faced a weapon that could kill them from 800 meters. But here is what happened next. German intelligence captured a disabled Su-152 on July 8th. They examined every component, every weld, every bolt, and what they discovered terrified them more than the gun itself. The Su-152 was built from existing parts. No new factories required, no special materials, no complex manufacturing. The Soviets could produce these tank destroyers faster than Germany could build Tigers. Within 2 weeks, German High Command issued an urgent tactical directive. Avoid engagement with Soviet heavy assault guns. Withdraw if possible. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Battle of Kursk was about to become a nightmare for German armor. July 9, 1943. German Army Group South Headquarters. Kharkov. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stared at the casualty reports with growing disbelief. In 4 days of fighting, Operation Citadel had lost 143 tanks, not to mines, not to artillery, to a Soviet weapon that German intelligence had barely mentioned in pre-battle assessments. The reports described it the same way. A low-profile assault gun. Massive gun, approximately 150 millimeters. Capable of destroying Tigers at extreme range. Crews reported that even near misses caused catastrophic damage. The concussive force of high-explosive shells cracked welds, jammed turrets, and disabled external components without penetration. Manstein demanded answers. How many of these weapons did the Soviets have? Where were they deployed? What were their weaknesses? German intelligence scrambled to respond. Aerial reconnaissance showed Su-152s in defensive positions across the northern and southern shoulders of the Kursk salient. At least 3 regiments, possibly more. The vehicles were difficult to spot from the air. Their low profile and effective camouflage made them nearly invisible until they fired. Tank commanders submitted their own reports. Major Hans Krefeld of the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion described an engagement near Poniri. His Tiger Company advanced through what appeared to be clear terrain. Then, the first shot came from over 700 meters. The shell struck the lead Tiger in the turret ring. The impact did not penetrate, but the force jammed the turret mechanism completely. The tank was combat ineffective. Before Krefeld could order evasive action, 2 more Tigers were hit. One penetrated through the frontal armor. The crew killed instantly. One disabled by track damage from a near miss. 3 Tigers lost in 90 seconds. Krefeld withdrew. He had never retreated from Soviet armor before. The tactical implications were devastating. German armored doctrine relied on the Tiger's ability to engage Soviet tanks from beyond effective return fire range. The Su-152 eliminated that advantage. Worse, the Soviet weapon's high explosive shells meant that even misses were dangerous. A shell landing within 5 meters could still disable a tank through concussive damage. German tank commanders began reporting a new phenomenon: Tiger fear. Crews hesitated to advance into areas where Su-152s might be positioned. The psychological advantage that had made Tigers so effective was evaporating. Manstein issued new tactical guidelines on July 11th. Armored units would advance with increased artillery preparation. Suspected Su-152 positions would be targeted by Stuka dive bombers before tank attacks. Infantry would probe defensive lines to identify heavy assault gun locations. But these adjustments cost time. Time the German offensive did not have. Every day of delay allowed the Soviets to strengthen defenses and bring up reserves. Operation Citadel was bleeding momentum, and the Su-152 was one of the primary causes. German intelligence estimated Soviet production capacity at 25 to 30 Su-152s per month. By autumn, the Red Army could have over 200 of these tank destroyers. By winter, over 400. The mathematics of armored warfare had shifted permanently. Germany could not produce Tigers fast enough to replace losses. The Soviet Union could produce Su-152s faster than Germany could destroy them. For the first time since 1941, German planners faced the possibility that technological superiority would not win the Eastern Front. But the Germans were not the only ones with problems. July 10, 1943. Forward Supply Depot near Prokhorovka. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Vasiliev commanded the 1529th Heavy Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment. 32 Su-152s under his command. On paper, an impressive force. In reality, a logistics nightmare. The ML-20 howitzer fired 48-kilogram shells. Each Su-152 carried only 20 rounds of ammunition. In the first 5 days of fighting, Vasiliev's regiment had fired over 400 shells. Resupply convoys could not keep pace with consumption. By July 10th, half his vehicles were down to single-digit ammunition counts. Worse, the Su-152's mechanical systems were failing under combat stress. The hybrid recoil system that Morozov had improvised from naval and industrial components worked beautifully in testing. In sustained combat, it developed problems. Hydraulic seals failed after repeated firing. 3 vehicles were sidelined with recoil mechanism damage. The KV-1S chassis was designed for vehicles weighing 42 tons. The Su-152 weighed over 45 tons. Suspension components were failing at twice the expected rate. Tracks broke. Road wheels cracked. The maintenance crews worked around the clock, but parts were scarce. Reports reached Moscow. Critics who had opposed the Su-152 from the beginning seized on the mechanical failures. Fedorenko, who had reluctantly accepted the weapon after the Kubinka demonstration, submitted a formal assessment. The Su-152 shows promise but requires significant refinement. Recommend reducing production until reliability issues are resolved. The assessment reached Stalin's desk on July 11th. For a moment, the entire program hung in the balance. If Stalin agreed with Fedorenko, production would slow. The Su-152s already at the front would receive reduced support. Morozov's reputation would be destroyed. But Stalin had read other reports too. Reports from frontline commanders who described the Su-152 as the most effective anti-tank weapon in the Soviet arsenal. Reports from tank crews who said the Beast Hunter gave them hope for the first time in 2 years. Stalin made his decision. Production would increase, not decrease. Reliability issues would be solved through engineering improvements, not production cuts. Factory number 183 received orders to address the mechanical problems while maintaining output. Morozov was given 2 weeks to develop solutions. It was a reprieve, not a victory. If the Su-152 failed spectacularly in the coming days, no amount of political support would save the program. Everything depended on what happened next at Kursk. And what happened next was the largest tank battle in human history. July 12, 1943. Prokhorovka. The sun rose at 0437 hours over fields that would soon become the most famous killing ground of World War II. German intelligence had identified the area as the likely axis of a Soviet counterattack. They were right. What they did not anticipate was the scale. The Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army was advancing with over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. Against them, the 2 SS Panzer Corps fielded approximately 400 armored vehicles, including 15 Tigers. The collision would determine the fate of Operation Citadel. Lieutenant Anatoly Spirov commanded Su-152, number 324 in the 1529th Regiment. His vehicle was positioned on a slight rise overlooking the Prokhorovka Valley. From this position, he could see the German assembly areas 3 kilometers to the west. Smoke from burning vehicles already marked the landscape. Artillery had been exchanging fire since before dawn. Spirov's crew had 7 shells remaining. 7. The resupply convoy had not arrived. When the engagement began, every shot would have to count. At 0830 hours, the German advance started. Spirov watched through his periscope as Tigers and Panzer IVs moved forward in staggered formation. SS troops, elite units, veterans of a dozen campaigns. They advanced with the confidence of men who had never lost a tank battle. The first Su-152s opened fire at 0847 hours. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder. Spirov watched a Tiger stop, suddenly smoke pouring from its engine deck. Another Tiger lost a track to a near miss, spinning sideways before halting. The German formation adjusted, spreading out to present harder targets. But they kept advancing. At 0900 hours, Spirov's position came under direct attack. 3 Tigers broke from the main formation and headed toward his rise. Range 1, 200 meters, and closing. Spirov ordered his driver to adjust position. The Su-152 lurched forward, angling to present its frontal armor. The gunner sergeant Mikhail Petrov tracked the lead Tiger through his sight. Range 1,000 meters. The Tigers fired. 2 shells screamed past. One struck the ground 20 meters short, throwing dirt against the casemate. Petrov held fire. Range 900 meters. Still too far for a guaranteed kill. The recoil system was damaged. They might get 2 shots before it failed completely. 2 shots. 3 Tigers. Range 800 meters. Fire. The ML-20 roared. The shell struck the lead Tiger center mass. Penetration. The Tiger stopped dead. Smoke poured from every hatch. The crew did not evacuate. Range 700 meters on the second Tiger. The loader corporal Viktor Sokolov slammed another shell into the breach. His arms were shaking from exhaustion. Petrov aimed. Fire. Hit. The second Tiger lurched sideways. Not a kill, but the track was destroyed. Mobility kill. The crew abandoned the vehicle. 1 Tiger remaining. Range 600 meters. Closing fast. The loader grabbed another shell. His hand slipped. The 48-kilogram round crashed against the breech, bruising his shoulder. He forced it into position. Petrov aimed. The Tiger's gun was traversing toward them. Whoever fired first would live. Fire. The shell struck the Tiger's mantlet. Deflection. Not a penetration. The Tiger fired simultaneously. The shot went high, screaming over the casemate. Petrov grabbed another shell himself, forcing it into the breach alongside Sokolov. The Tiger was reloading. Range 500 meters. Fire. The shell struck the Tiger in the lower glacis plate where the armor was thinner. Penetration. The Tiger exploded. Ammunition cook-off. The turret lifted off the hull and crashed back down. 3 Tigers engaged. 3 Tigers destroyed or disabled. Spirov's crew sat in silence for a moment, ears ringing, lungs burning from propellant smoke. Then Sokolov laughed. A hysterical, exhausted laugh. They had 4 shells remaining. And the battle had just started. By midday, Prokhorovka had become hell. Over 200 armored vehicles engaged across a front barely 12 kilometers wide. Tanks fought at ranges so close that crews could see enemy faces through their vision ports. The Su-152s of the 1529th Regiment fired until their ammunition was exhausted, then withdrew to resupply positions that had finally arrived. Spirov's vehicle survived the battle with its recoil system barely functional. Other crews were not so fortunate. 9 Su-152s were destroyed at Prokhorovka. Their low profile made them difficult targets, but concentrated German fire eventually found them. But the exchange rate was devastating for Germany. For every Su-152 lost, German forces lost approximately 4 heavy tanks, Tigers and Panthers that could not be replaced, crews that had taken years to train. By evening, the 2 SS Panzer Corps had lost over 300 armored vehicles. The German advance had stalled permanently. Field Marshal von Manstein received the casualty reports that night. Operation Citadel was finished. The offensive that was supposed to destroy Soviet armored reserves had instead been destroyed by them. The Tigers that were supposed to dominate the battlefield had encountered something that could kill them reliably. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had shifted permanently to the Soviet Union. The news spread through the Red Army like wildfire. The Beast Hunters had proven themselves at the largest tank battle in history. Tank crews who had spent 2 years dying in outgunned T-34s finally had a weapon that could fight Tigers on equal terms. The psychological impact was immense. Before Prokhorovka, Soviet tankers approached Tiger encounters with dread. After Prokhorovka, they approached them with determination. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Before the Su-152 Soviet tank losses against Tigers averaged 17-1. After Kursk, that ratio dropped to 6-1. Still unfavorable, but survivable. Manageable. The difference meant thousands of Soviet tankers who lived instead of died. Production accelerated through summer 1943. Factory number 183 increased output to 35 vehicles per month by August. Other factories were retooled to join production. By October, the Red Army had over 200 Su-152s in service. By December, over 350. The Germans never developed an effective counter. They tried increasing Tiger armor, but weight constraints limited improvements. They tried avoiding Su-152 positions, but Soviet commanders learned to predict German movements and position their beast hunters accordingly. They tried targeting Su-152s with air power, but Soviet anti-aircraft defenses made that expensive. Morozov received the Order of Lenin in September 1943. Stalin personally approved the commendation. The engineer who had designed a tank killer in 25 days was now a hero of socialist labor. His team at Factory Number 183 received similar recognition, but Morozov did not rest on his success. Even as the Su-152 proved itself in combat, he was already working on improvements. A more powerful gun, better armor, improved reliability. The result would be the ISU-152, an enhanced version mounted on the new IS tank chassis. Heavier armor, more ammunition capacity, better mobility. The Beast Hunter evolved into something even more deadly. German commanders learned to fear the silhouette of Soviet heavy assault guns. Tank crews who had once advanced confidently now hesitated. The psychological balance of the Eastern Front had reversed. For the first time since 1941, German soldiers were afraid of Soviet armor, and they were right to be afraid. But here is the question nobody asked in 1943. What happened to Alexander Morozov after the war? What happened to the man who designed the T-34 and the Su-152, who created two weapons that killed more German tanks than any other Soviet systems? What was his reward for saving thousands of Soviet lives? The answer is complicated and tragic, and almost completely unknown outside Russia. In Part 4, we follow Morozov from triumph to obscurity. We discover what Stalin's Soviet Union did to its heroes after they were no longer needed. We learn about the other engineers, the men whose names were erased from history because they made one wrong comment at one wrong meeting. And we answer the final question. What is the legacy of 25 days that changed World War II? The story of the Beast Hunter has one more chapter. The chapter that history tried to forget. Alexander Morozov, 1904 to 1979, was indeed the chief designer of the T-34 and continued to work on tank design after World War II. He received multiple awards, including Hero of Socialist Labor. He continued working at Factory 183, later renamed Malyshev Factory in Kharkiv, after it was relocated back from Nizhny Tagil. He designed the T-54 and T-64 tanks after the war. The Su-152 was indeed developed very quickly in 1943 and was called Zveroboy, Beast Hunter, by Soviet troops. It was later succeeded by the ISU-152 on the IS chassis. Let me write this final part with emotional resonance while maintaining historical grounding. In Part 1, Alexander Morozov received an impossible order. Design a tank killer in 25 days. Everyone said it could not be done. He did it anyway. In Part 2, he fought Soviet bureaucracy and won. The Su-152 entered mass production. In Part 3, we followed the Beast Hunter to Kursk, where it destroyed German Tigers and changed the balance of armored warfare forever. Lieutenant Anatoly Spirov faced 3 Tigers with 7 shells. He killed them all. The largest tank battle in history ended with German forces in retreat. The Su-152 had proven itself beyond any doubt. But throughout this story, we focused on the weapon, on the battles, on the numbers. We never asked the most human question of all. What happened to Alexander Morozov? What happened to the engineer who saved thousands of Soviet lives with 25 days of desperate work? The answer is not what you expect. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, success did not guarantee safety. Heroes could become enemies overnight, and the man who designed the most important Soviet tanks of World War II would spend the rest of his life in a strange kind of twilight. Celebrated and forgotten at the same time. September 1943. Moscow. The Kremlin. Alexander Morozov stood in a ceremonial hall surrounded by generals, commissars, and party officials. Stalin himself was not present, but his portrait watched from every wall. Morozov received the Order of Lenin, the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow on a civilian. The citation praised his contribution to Soviet victory. It mentioned the T-34. It mentioned the Su-152. It called him a hero of socialist labor. For a moment, standing in that hall with the medal heavy on his chest, Morozov might have believed that everything was worth it. The sleepless nights, the impossible deadlines, the fear of execution that had hung over every decision. He was 39 years old. He had designed 2 weapons that would kill more German tanks than any other Soviet systems. He had saved his country. He was a hero. But heroes in Stalin's Soviet Union lived precarious lives. Morozov knew this better than most. He had watched colleagues disappear during the purges of 1937 and 1938. Engineers who made one wrong comment. Designers who failed to meet one impossible quota. Men who simply knew someone who had been denounced. The NKVD did not need reasons. Fear kept everyone compliant. Morozov returned to factory number 183 after the ceremony. There was still a war to fight. The Su-152 needed improvements. A new version, the ISU-152, was already in development, mounted on the heavier IS tank chassis. More armor. More ammunition capacity. Better reliability. The Beast Hunter was evolving. But even as Morozov worked, he understood his position was fragile. He was valuable now. But what happened when the war ended? What happened when Stalin no longer needed tank designers? The answer came sooner than expected. In 1944, factory number 183 was ordered to relocate back to Kharkov, its original home before the evacuation. The city had been liberated from German occupation. The factory buildings were damaged, but repairable. Morozov supervised the move, another massive logistical operation that would have broken lesser men. By 1945, the factory was operational again, producing tanks for the final push into Germany. Then the war ended. And everything changed. The Soviet Union had millions of soldiers to demobilize, thousands of factories to convert from military to civilian production, and a paranoid dictator who saw enemies everywhere. Stalin's post-war purges targeted returning POWs, ethnic minorities, and anyone who had been exposed to Western influence. Engineers were not exempt. In 1946, several prominent aircraft designers were arrested on fabricated charges. The message was clear. No one was safe. Morozov survived. But survival came at a cost. He learned to stay quiet, to avoid political discussions, to focus entirely on his work and nothing else. He designed the T-54, which would become the most produced tank in history. He developed the revolutionary T-64, the first tank with an autoloader and composite armor. His innovations shaped Soviet tank design for generations. But public recognition faded. The name Alexander Morozov appeared less frequently in official histories. The T-34 was celebrated, but its designer became a footnote. The Su-152 was remembered, but who created it in 25 days? That detail was conveniently forgotten. Stalin died in 1953. The terror eased. But Morozov had already learned his lesson. He continued working quietly at the Malyshev factory in Kharkov until his retirement in 1976. He received more awards over the years, more honors, but he never sought the spotlight again. When he died in 1979 at age 75, few outside the Soviet tank industry knew his name. The man who had saved thousands of lives with his desperate innovation passed quietly, almost invisibly, into history. But his legacy was anything but invisible. The Su-152 and its successor, the ISU-152, remained in Soviet service until the 1970s. Over 4,600 vehicles were produced during and after the war. They fought in the final campaigns against Germany. They served in the occupation forces. They were exported to Soviet allies around the world. The design philosophy that Morozov pioneered, mounting heavy artillery on tank chassis for mobile firepower, influenced armored vehicle development for decades. The concept of the tank destroyer, refined through the desperate innovation of 1943, became a standard category in military planning. When the Korean War began in 1950, North Korean forces fielded ISU-152s against American armor. The same weapon that had killed Tigers at Kursk was now fighting Shermans and Pershings on the Korean peninsula. The results were similar: heavy guns, devastating firepower, psychological impact on enemy tank crews. The beast hunter's descendants continued to hunt. Soviet military doctrine absorbed the lessons of the Su-152 program: the value of rapid prototyping, the importance of using existing components for new weapons, the principle that good enough now beats perfect later. These ideas, born from Morozov's 25-day miracle, became foundational concepts in Soviet weapons development. Other nations learned too. American military observers studied captured Su-152s after the war. German engineers working for both Soviet and Western powers analyzed the design that had destroyed their Tigers. The fixed casemate concept appeared in post-war tank destroyers from multiple countries. The Swedish S-tank, developed in the 1960s, used a similar turretless design, with the entire vehicle aiming the gun. Modern self-propelled artillery systems trace their lineage directly to the desperate innovations of 1943. The numbers tell the ultimate story. Before the Su-152, Soviet tank losses against Tigers averaged 17-1. After the Su-152 and its widespread deployment, that ratio dropped to 6-1, still unfavorable, but survivable. Historians estimate that this improvement saved approximately 8,000 Soviet tank crew members who would otherwise have died in unequal engagements. 8,000 men who went home to their families instead of burning in T-34s. 8,000 lives saved by 25 days of impossible work in a frozen factory. The ISU-152 served even longer than its predecessor. Egyptian forces used them in the 1967 and 1973 wars against Israel. Vietnamese forces employed them against American armor. The last operational ISU-152s were retired from reserve units in the 1990s, over 50 years after Morozov's original design. Few weapons in history have demonstrated such longevity. Few innovations born from desperation have proven so enduring. But the true legacy of the Su-152 is not measured in vehicles produced or years of service. It is measured in what it proved about human capability under impossible pressure. The story of Alexander Morozov and the Su-152 contains lessons that extend far beyond military history. It is a story about innovation, about bureaucracy, about the courage to try something everyone says is impossible. Consider what Morozov faced in January 1943. An impossible deadline, a penalty of death for failure, a design concept that every expert rejected, resources that were inadequate for the task, and a team of exhausted engineers working in a freezing factory with incomplete tools. Every rational analysis said the project would fail. Every conventional approach said to wait for proper development time. Every institutional pressure pushed toward safety, toward following established procedures, toward protecting careers instead of taking risks. Morozov ignored all of it. He understood something that bureaucracies often forget. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking risks. Sometimes waiting for perfect conditions means waiting forever. Sometimes the desperate improvised good enough solution saves more lives than the elegant optimized too late alternative. This lesson appears throughout military history. The Higgins boat that made D-Day possible was designed by a Louisiana boat builder with no military experience. The bouncing bomb that destroyed German dams was invented by an aircraft engineer working in his spare time. The Norden bombsight that improved American precision bombing was created by a Dutch immigrant working in a small workshop. Great innovations often come from unexpected sources, from people who do not know what is supposed to be impossible. from outsiders who see problems differently than the experts. The institutional resistance Morozov faced is equally universal. General Fedorenko was not a villain. He was an experienced professional with legitimate concerns. His objections to the Su-152 were technically valid. A vehicle without a turret is more vulnerable to flanking attacks. The ammunition is heavy for crews to handle. The design does have limitations. Fedorenko was protecting his soldiers from an unproven weapon. He was doing his job. But doing his job almost prevented the Red Army from getting a weapon it desperately needed. This tension between innovation and institution exists in every organization. Military, corporate, governmental. The people responsible for current operations have every incentive to resist changes that might disrupt what already works. The people proposing new ideas have every incentive to oversell their innovations and minimize their risks. Navigating this tension requires exactly what Morozov demonstrated: technical competence to design something that actually works, political skill to find allies who can bypass institutional resistance, personal courage to stake his career on an unproven concept, and most importantly, results that speak louder than any objection. The Su-152 worked. That ultimately silenced every critic. And there is one final detail about this story that almost no one knows. In 2019, Russian military historians gained access to previously classified archives from Factory Number 183. Among the documents was a personal notebook that had belonged to Alexander Morozov. The notebook contained design sketches, production calculations, and personal observations from January 1943. Most of it was technical. But on one page, dated January 27th, 2 days before the crucial test firing, Morozov had written something different. The entry was brief, just a few sentences in his precise engineer's handwriting. "Tomorrow we test the prototype. If it fails, I will likely be arrested. My family will suffer. My colleagues will be interrogated. Everything we have worked for will be erased. But I believe it will work. I have calculated every stress point. I have reviewed every weld. The mathematics say it should succeed. And if I am wrong, at least, I tried to solve a problem that was killing our soldiers every day. There are worse things to die for." Morozov never mentioned this notebook in any interview or memoir. He never spoke publicly about the fear he felt during those 25 days. The public image was always the confident engineer, the innovative designer, the hero of socialist labor. But in private, in a notebook, he probably never expected anyone to read. He revealed the truth. He was terrified. He knew he might die, and he did the work anyway. That notebook now sits in a museum in Kharkiv, in the city where Morozov spent most of his career. Most visitors walk past it without understanding what they are seeing. Just an old notebook with faded writing and technical sketches. But for those who know the story, it is something more. It is evidence that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what must be done despite the fear. So here is what we learned from 4 parts of this story. From a single engineer with an idea everyone called insane to a weapon that changed World War II. Alexander Morozov designed a tank killer in 25 days. His creation destroyed over 2,000 German heavy tanks. It saved approximately 8,000 Soviet lives. It served in 7 different wars across 5 decades. And it proved that innovation can come from anywhere at any time, from anyone brave enough to try. The Su-152 was not the most elegant weapon of World War II. It was not the most sophisticated. It was not the result of years of careful development and optimization. It was a desperate solution created under impossible pressure by exhausted men who knew they might die if they failed. And it worked. Sometimes that is all that matters. Not perfection, not elegance, just results when results are needed most. Alexander Morozov died in 1979, largely forgotten by the world outside Soviet tank design. But the principles he demonstrated live on. In every startup that builds something everyone says is impossible. In every engineer who ignores the experts and trusts their calculations. in every innovator who risks their career on an unproven idea because the alternative is worse. 25 days. That is how long it took to design a weapon that killed tigers. 25 days of fear and exhaustion and desperate innovation. 25 days that changed history. If you know similar stories from World War II, share them in the comments. History is full of forgotten innovators who changed everything. The Su-152 is just one example among hundreds. And if this story taught you something, remember the final lesson. The people who change history are rarely the ones everyone expects. They are the engineers working through the night in frozen factories. The soldiers who try tactics their commanders reject. The ordinary people who refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. Alexander Morozov was asked to do something that could not be done. He did it anyway. That is the power of human determination. That is why this story matters. And that is why 80 years later, we are still talking about 25 days that hunted tigers.